They say you should never judge a book by its cover, but when the cover is this bad, it's kind of difficult not to. This PC is owned by a viewer in the Orlando, Florida area. They reached out asking for help. They essentially put a bunch of stuff into a case that didn't really fit the components chosen, and cable management, to say the least, is lackluster. As someone who's built dozens of PCs over the years, I can tell you firsthand, there's no worse feeling that, well, okay, I shouldn't say that. The worst feeling is when the rig doesn't work. You spend a bunch of money, 1,000 plus USD, it doesn't even have to be that. It could be $500 on a budget rig, and you put it all together and it doesn't work. That's probably worst case scenario. The second worst case scenario is when it all works, but it ends up looking sort of like this. And I'm not trying to knock on the owner here. I think they went into this with good intentions, but the outcome visually is far from what they expected. And a lot of this can be fixed very simply by swapping to a much smaller, more compact chassis. I love the O11 Vision, and this one in white is no exception, but it doesn't make sense to pair an mATX motherboard with a case this large. Couple that with only a 120mm AIO when this chassis supports 360s and above, and you end up with just a bunch of empty space, cables strewed everywhere, reaching for the motherboard when if you used a full-size one, you wouldn't have to see as many of those cable strands. It doesn't look as clean and cohesive. A lot of that, again, falls on the case. We're gonna fix that in this video. We're also going to focus heavily on cable management to help clean up the overall look. Might not seem as though just a case swap alone and some attention to cable management can make that big of a difference, but I invite you to trust the process. I hope you will stay with me.
Are you sitting on a gaming PC without an activated copy of Windows? Forget $100+ retail keys. Instead, snag an OEM Windows 10 or 11 key for a fraction of the price to unlock the full potential of the OS. Oh, and don't worry, they'll still remove those pesky activation watermarks. Click the links below to get started today and easily activate with your key under the Activation tab within Windows Settings. And be sure to use our special offer code SKGS for a sweet discount on a variety of options, including Windows 10 and 11, Pro and Home, and more.
Before we kick off the disassembly, I'd like to go over the specifications of this rig. Actually, an older platform, Z370 and a Core i7-8700K. There are 64 gigs of white DDR4 attached from Corsair, and we're also cooling the CPU with a 120mm Corsair AIO. Again, a bit questionable there, and definitely underkill for this chassis. The graphics card is an RTX 2080 Super, and of course, as mentioned before, the case is a Lian Li O11 Vision in white. I'm not sure whose idea it was to pair these black and brown Noctua fans with this chassis. I think the owner said a friend recommended these because they're of great quality, and they certainly are, but aesthetically they make no sense here, which is why the case we've chosen is black instead of white. By the way, all of this stuff has already been cleared in advance with the owner, so it's not like we're throwing anything in the rig that they're not gonna like. You can see for primary storage, we have a 970 EVO Plus from Samsung, and the power supply is an 850-watt fully modular unit from Deepcool. Now, the case we'll be switching to is from a company called Johnsbow, which is not very common, not very popular here in the US, and maybe in other countries. It's just not mainstream here, not like Corsair and NZXT and Fractal and others are. And so, yes, I took a bit of a risk opting for this chassis, but the product photos seem to indicate that it's a well-built chassis and that it will better suit the hardware we're starting with. You see, one of the most important things you can do aesthetically for your PC build is to choose a case that supports up to the size of your motherboard. For example, if I choose an mATX board to start with, I don't want to choose a case that supports up to ATX because we'll end up with this result here, where we have a bunch of dead space below the motherboard and several cables reaching up from much further down than we'd see otherwise. On the other hand, this D32 here only supports up to mATX, so our board should feel much more at home. Now, since I've never worked with this case before, I figured why not do like a one-take unboxing, see what we get inside. I'll give you my first impressions of it all. It's not a very heavy chassis. That could indicate that the, thin steel that they use is ow, God, that hurt really bad. I actually saw that spark as well. Here she is then, in all her glory, the Johnsbow or Jonesbow, no idea if I'm saying that correctly, D32 STD. You can see we've got mostly clear tempered glass on the left side, not heavily tinted at all, although these thumb screws are not captive, which kind of sucks. It's a cheaper chassis, and that was one of the points I was trying to prove here, is you don't need to spend a ton of money on a case either to achieve that aesthetic result you're looking for, so long as the case makes sense with the dimensions of the other hardware chosen. These PCIe slot covers are removable, so it's not like a single-use setup that you see in a lot of cheaper chassis. We do get a bunch of hardware here mounted toward the front. And if you can't already tell, this case supports power supplies mounted at the front, which might impede the longer graphics cards that you see today if your power supply is especially long. So if it's a shorter unit, you should be okay. The card will sort of start mounting down here. So as long as your power supply is more squared off than rectangular, you should be okay. You can see we're working with a pass-through power cable design, which makes sense, of course, because the PSU is mounted toward the front. And I've got to say, I'm digging these subtle goldish accents on an otherwise black frame. Bit of a size comparison here, where we are starting and where we will end up. The Johnsbo chassis is so much smaller than the O11 Vision, and this isn't intended to be a direct comparison between the two. Of course, if I had to just pick between these two cases, I would personally go with the O11 Vision. I think it's a better built chassis. It does cost a lot more. It's in a different price bracket, but it all around just feels very premium, but it doesn't, again, make sense for any of the hardware in it. And that's why I think this Johnsbo case will make much more sense. So let's get on with disassembly, shall we? Starting first with this graphics card. This is not a longer card, thankfully. It would work in our Johnsbo case with a larger power supply, though I don't think we'll have an issue with the Deepcool 850. Disconnect some power cables. Come on now. A bit stubborn. We've got our little retention clip, and card should slide right out. I don't see a need to disassemble the platform, so we'll keep the DDR4 installed as well as the CPU, probably even the cooler, although we could quickly repaste off camera just to be on the safe side. These USB 3.0 cables are so stubborn. Also worth noting, if I didn't clarify this earlier, we will be migrating these Noctua fans to the new case as well. Our Johnsbo chassis doesn't come with any fans, which is one of the reasons why it is a cheaper case. So if you do want to build in one, make sure that you add a few fans to your cart. Removal is a bit awkward since the AIO is still attached, but we'll make it work. And this part's especially important. Don't forget your rear IO shield. I do it all the time. Taking care of these fans next. Easy does it. There were a couple 2.5-inch SATA drives back here. Glad I didn't forget these. We'll migrate them over along with their SATA data cables. I think these just, yeah, you just slide them to the left and they pull right out. That one's a little more stubborn. And lastly here, our power supply. This will slide out from the rear. Careful, and then we'll feed all of the cables back through. This here is just about everything. I've even retained the screws, although your replacement case should have everything you need to remount. I've also retained this rat's nest of RGB strips, which you don't see too much of nowadays. Usually it's the fans that are RGB supported, or the case will have baked in strips. So this is gonna make things a bit more difficult. That should make for a more interesting video, demonstrate a more worst case scenario. I'm gonna kick things off with this rear IO shield just so I don't forget. Again, once you have the motherboard installed, it's pretty much impossible to get these in after the fact. I'm gonna take care of one missing standoff. I always wanna double check that before you get a motherboard, especially in a smaller case like this. Sometimes the standoffs aren't in the right locations, and that could result in catastrophic damage. Not trying to scare you there, but it is worth looking at. Let's get the platform in. Oh, I'm completely, I'm in the wrong orientation here. There we go. And let's get rear IO lined up. Definitely a bit funky with this AIO in the way. I'm just gonna kind of suspend it from above and make sure that this is all where it should be. It's a bit stubborn. That looks good. And we'll tighten things down for good measure. I believe these are 632s. And with the AIO mounted, you can sort of see our starting point with the new chassis. Now, I haven't wired anything yet. I'll show you what I do, some tips and tricks to help hide these, because at the end of the day, in my opinion, if you can hide more of these smaller, sort of like spaghetti stringy cables, the cleaner your rig will look. For starters, we'll want as many of these front IO cables run behind the motherboard tray as possible. This chassis doesn't, again, have a basement, so we'll have to be very meticulous about how we route these smaller ones. Front panel will go here, USB 3 a bit further up, and HD audio off to the far left. Once these are all connected, you'll want to carefully pull back on them such that all of the slack is behind the motherboard tray where we can't see it. You can see I've done the same thing already for our AIO CPU block cables. So we have an extra like daisy chain of PWM fan connectors running from it, as well as I believe the power connector for the pump in here. And both of those are kind of channeled between our DIMM slots and the block up to the top. and then routed behind the board. Now we can shift our attention to these remaining two 120s. I'm going to orient them such that their inverse stickers are facing inwards so that we get fresh air from below for our graphics card, and such that the cables for each fan run toward the back of the board. Again, our goal is to minimize cable exposure, right? So if we had our fans flipped such that the cables for each were running from this side, it'd be pretty difficult to hide them. Now we can reinsert our dust filter. Now for the RGB strips, this was pretty difficult, I won't lie. So I've got the first one starting from back here near the HD audio. That's where the power cable will run to the box. I've got the first strip here along the back side of the fans. I wanted to put it up near the front, but I don't have space for that and it would look silly to put them on top. So I've got one running along the back. I've got the second running along the inside of this cover, and then the third is running along the top here near the front. So this one will probably be illuminating most of the rig. We do have some underglow potential with that back one there, and then we'll have our power supply up near the front. So that's not really gonna do us a ton of help, that second one there, but I wanna use as many as possible. There is a fourth, but it just doesn't make sense in this chassis, so I'll give it back to the owner. You get a better sense of where that second one is running along the cover there up to the top. I thought this was pretty clever. This is actually how Jonesbo intends for you to mount 2.5-inch SSDs. There is another one of these toward the front, but I'm gonna mount both of them beside each other right behind the motherboard, and it just takes 2 screws to hold them in place instead of the usual 4. Again, these are SSDs, so no moving parts. I don't really see a problem with this. I think it's kind of clever, actually. Now for this next part, we're gonna be cable managing for a good 20 or 30 minutes. I know that seems a little over the top for really any build, save like a show build, but we want to take advantage of as much space as we have back here, and it becomes more difficult to do that once the power supply is in and a lot of bulkier cables get in the way. So my recommendation is to cable manage the smaller stuff first and then install the power supply. This will take time and it is extremely case dependent. Thankfully, Jonesbo includes several zip tie points in this chassis along with zip ties themselves to help clean things up. This is more of a worst case scenario because we have 2 external, well, they're SSDs, they're internal drives, but they are not M.2s, so they need 2 cables apiece running to them. We also have tons of RGB in here and a couple of extra fans. So with all of that thrown into the mix and a smaller chassis at our disposal, you really have to get creative with where some of these extra cables run. You can see I have sort of kind of managed to pull it off here. It's not perfect and it will be a tight fit once this right side panel is installed, but this is about as good as I could do given the limited space back here. We don't want anything toward the front because that you'll see through the left side panel even with the power supply installed. And remember, we haven't installed that unit yet. That's gonna add a lot of clutter to the mix. And speaking of, we can go ahead and situate that, or at least attempt to. Again, I'm gonna place the fan facing the front so it has fresh air and so that it's not competing with anything else in this case. It actually seems to bolt up very easily here. Just 4 screws as usual with the top panel removed. Fairly easy access to everything. Let's not forget our power cable while we're here. I'm also gonna do something about these more rigid AIO tubes because of the way that they run directly into the block from above. They will probably end up hitting the tempered glass side panel. I'm going to use a zip tie here to try to keep that from happening. We'll tackle this 24 pin, a little bit of board flex there, but that looks to be secure now. I've got my 8-pin EPS running next to the power cable up top, and I think that, makes for the cleanest runs possible for this cable. Oh, it's gonna be tight back here though, I will say. You can see here's maybe a better shot of what I was just working on. And now it's time for the RTX 2080 Super. You can see just how flush this card is with other stuff in this case. This is probably the perfect size card, to be honest. A couple screws back here to tighten it all down. Took a few pieces of single-sided adhesive rubber standoffs from a different rig and actually stacked them on top of each other. The card was leaning quite a bit toward the front of the case and I didn't want it hitting the fan here. So kind of a just improv solution. Not the cleanest, but it does serve its purpose. And here we go with the cables. So one 8-pin there, and then the other next to it. These are completely separate cables, just looks a little better this way instead of going with the daisy chain method. I'll be totally honest with you, I'm not super happy with the way things have turned out behind this motherboard tray. Again, this is more a worst case scenario. There are tons of cables here. I think the one thing that would really seal the deal for making this a serious pain is if we had cable extensions. You barely see the cables in this chassis, so I'm not worried about dumping a little extra money into that if the owner wants to later. It shouldn't be too difficult, at least on the left side, but back here, cable extensions would mean us having to really occupy space below the power supply. And you can still see some of this from the left side. So I tried my best to keep as much of it as possible behind the motherboard tray for the sake of looks. The payoff is definitely on this side of the equation. It looks so much better than where we started, but it's not finished quite yet. Some of these components are a bit dirty. Let's take it outside and give her a quick dusting. In hindsight, I definitely should have done this when each component was removed from the original case. I got a bit ahead of myself there, but better late than never. That should just about do it. I want a quick sanity check before we drop this back off with the viewer. Let's make sure that it powers on firstly. It does appear to do that well, but is it going to post? I checked this beforehand. I didn't do it on camera, but at the beginning, before we took anything apart, that's important. Just want to make sure you cover yourself, especially when you're doing this stuff for other people. That there was our post. I do believe, yeah, it loads into Windows as well, super quick. So, alrighty, that is all we need to cover on the sanity check side. Wouldn't you say then, this is a pretty radical transformation given we only changed one component of this entire rig, that being, of course, the case. We also spent a bit of time on cable management, which makes a world of difference in a smaller chassis like this. Pretty much everything on this side has minimal cable exposure, allowing us to see the expensive components, show them off, especially through a left side panel that is made of tempered glass. Now, some folks out there might not care at all about cable management. Some folks maybe have solid left side panels and just don't want to waste the time. That would be how they would look at it, and that's fine. That's your right. I do think you should take a little bit of pride in your work though. Just sort some cables, spend a few minutes running things traditionally where they should so that you don't have cases where maybe a fan snags a cable or something. That would be pretty awful. And it could, in a dire situation, also affect temperatures to an extent depending on how compact your case is. We were also able to improve functionality a bit by hopping to this more compact design since we were able to move these 120mm fans just below the graphics card for fresh air intake. In the O11 Vision originally, there was a ton of empty space, and while that's not detrimental to airflow and temperatures long term, the airflow paths just didn't make a ton of sense because we had so many unoccupied fan areas. So in this config, we have two dedicated intakes, one exhaust out the rear through the AIO, which makes sense, and one isolated fan in the power supply, typical of what you'd see in a case with a basement with the PSU fan side down. It's not really affecting anything else in the rig, and I'm okay with that. The end result then is something fairly transformative, whereas before we had plenty of empty space and hardware that just really didn't make sense when mixed together. I mean, a 120mm AIO and a large Lian Li O11 Vision, that's a bit crazy. That sets aside the fact that a 120mm is cooling a higher end Intel CPU from a few generations ago, but we're not here to tackle that. It's cooling enough as is. I've checked temperatures in the BIOS. I also want to make very clear that this video is not sponsored in any way by the Johnsbow brand. I, again, have never even really heard of them prior to today. I have seen a couple of their listings online. I never really paid too much attention because I hadn't heard the name before. But my first impressions with this chassis are positive. This reminds me of like a deep cool style case. I've seen a few from them, Antec. It has some traits that remind me of other more mainstream, at least here in the US, case manufacturers and designers. And so I can't really fault them for much here. There was enough cable management room for pretty much a disaster back there, and the right panel fit with ease. And yeah, you even get support for larger power supplies and or larger graphics cards depending on the config. I'll have most of the newer stuff in this rig linked below. I don't really think there's a point in building this exact rig given its age, but if you are interested in the case, let's say, or maybe the graphics card or something along those lines, maybe the Noctua fans, be sure to check out the links below. It's always super fun getting to play a role in these redesigns. I think it is a fairly universal opinion that chassis that are much too large for the motherboards in question just look a bit silly. It does a disservice to the case if you ask me. The O11 Vision is better suited for larger boards and more expandability, whereas in this case, a board was chosen with limited expandability and a fairly solid graphics card. That trade-off was likely made back then and is probably still the case today, otherwise they would have upgraded the board. And that's not impossible to do, it just might not be the most economical today, given what is available brand new from AMD and Intel. All that to say, considering the hardware we're working with in the present, this case choice makes a ton more sense, and I think the results speak for themselves. Oh, and don't worry, the O11 Vision is going back to its owner. They can give it to a friend or family member or throw another build inside of it. It just, yeah, doesn't belong anywhere near those other components. If you enjoyed this one, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing if you have not already. Check out our new channel, Salazar's Cars, and be sure to stick around for the next one. My name's Greg. Thanks for learning with me.